This week on the Mindful Men podcast. For people that haven't heard of muscular dystrophy before, can you share a bit about what it is and how it impacts you?
Sure thing. So muscular dystrophy, it's rather complicated to try and explain because I believe there's probably around 26 different types of it, give or take. And it affects everybody differently and how it impacts, your muscles completely differently. But in a nutshell, what muscular dystrophy is in the name muscle. So it impacts your muscles, and dystrophy basically weakness. So you're born with weak muscles to begin with. And depending on where that is sort of in the muscle, some people, for example, have Duchenne muscular dystrophy, which is the most well-known type. And basically that affects the dystrophin gene. So when you use your muscles, the dystrophin will usually repair it and rebuild your muscles that way. But for guys that have Duchenne, you use your muscles, it files down, but your muscles won't repair. The degree of weakness is more rapid, and it impacts essentially every muscle in your body. So heart, lungs, swallowing muscles, the ability to talk, blink, all that sort of stuff. For me, with my type of MD, mine's called Ulrich's. Having said that, there's a few specialists now that are questioning my biopsy results, and they're sort of putting me between Ulrich's and Bethlem. So they're very, very similar. They're still the collagen 6A2 gene, but I've sort of got characteristics and symptoms of both. So for me, I'm very, very lucky in that I can still walk. Specialist at the time when I was diagnosed said that I wouldn't be walking past the age of about 11, which is roughly thereabouts the time that people with Duchenne stop walking and rely on mobility aids. But for me, I'm still able to walk short distances. It impacts sort of my lung function, which is the big one for me, and my lung capacity, ability to get up and down off of chairs and things like that, putting on shoes. It will also contract my joints and my muscles. So, for example, my arms are sort of bent inwards a little bit. I can't straighten them completely. And same with my Achilles, I walk on my toes. Some
Hmm.
people think is nifty and think that I can walk in heels. I cannot walk in heels to save my life. Yeah, that's a little bit about MD.
When did MD come into your life? It was a young age, I understand.
Yeah, so I was diagnosed when I was 3. So muscular dystrophy is something you're born with. Contrary to what people in my school used to think, it's not something you can catch. It's something you are born with. Some people have it because their parents, one parent might have already had MD. For me, no one in my family has a history of muscular dystrophy. I was that one in, I think it was a 1 in 4, which was even more bizarre given that no one in my family has a history of it. So, yeah, it popped up then, but I wasn't formally diagnosed until when I was 3.
If none of your family had it, how does it come if you haven't had the family history?
That I'm still trying to work out. I did have a geneticist appointment way back in year 12, so I was 16 at the time, which is a very heavy conversation to have when you're 16 and they're talking about, well, who's to blame, if is anyone to blame, and what's your likelihood of having children and all that sort of stuff. But at the time, they were trying to figure it out. And I think they just came back to it was just a complete fluke,
Hmm.
from what I recall.
Yeah, is it quite a common condition?
Oh, I'm not sure on the stats specifically, but it's certainly not common at all. Duchenne's sort of the more prevalent in the muscular dystrophy family, but for me, my condition is even more rare. So the research and treatments available is even less so than people with Duchenne.
And I guess adds to that flukiness without the family history for you to experience that. And so you mentioned that being diagnosed at 3, like what were the symptoms or signs that led to that diagnosis? Have your parents talked about it?
Yeah, I mean, me and my family we're great in that we share a lot and are very, very open and honest with each other. And I did ask way back in the day what led to going down that path of trying to get a diagnosis. I was the first child, so they hadn't had experience, so they weren't sure of the right milestones that I was meeting. But a few of the telltale signs was I never could crawl the typical way that a toddler could crawl. I would commando crawl and belly crawl. And whenever I'd go to stand up off the floor, I'd have to sort of walk my hands up my legs to stand up, whereas so many people can just sort of put their legs under them and hop up that way. For me, that was never something that I could do. And my grandparents actually pointed out to them that something wasn't quite right. I was trying to get up their stairs at their place. And they said to my parents, like, something doesn't look right. She's taking a little bit longer, and how she's trying to navigate the stairs is just a little bit different. That was sort of the one thing that made them go, okay, we might need to go speak to someone about this, and which then started a whole whirlwind journey and a trip to Sydney, I believe. And yeah.
I was going to ask you that, like, what's the diagnosis process? I mean, that was a fair while ago now, and obviously you're 3, so you don't remember any of it probably. But yeah, how complicated is it to go through that diagnosis process?
I sort of got most of the story from my family and how scary and uncertain that was for them. But yeah, I vaguely recall memories of laying in a hospital bed kicking and screaming for my family after I woke up, because how they diagnosed, they did a muscle biopsy. So I've got a good scar on my leg from where they did the biopsy, and they didn't alert my family that I was back in recovery. And my family had to go and ask a doctor, how's everything going? It's taking a while. Is everything okay? Because being under anesthesia for someone with MD is quite risky. And they're like, is everything okay? And they're like, oh, she's back in her room. And they're like, okay. And they ran in and I was kicking and screaming, and that wasn't enjoyable. But the process, seeing so many doctors and specialists, and my mother in particular can very much vividly still recall the day of that she received the diagnosis with my dad. And she said she just had that feeling. She was sitting in my room and she said to my dad, I have a feeling from now on things are never going to be the same again. She said she just had that gut feel. And yeah, the doctor took him into their room and she said, one look. That as soon as I looked at the doctor, I knew something wasn't right. And he said, she's got muscular dystrophy. They'd never heard of it before. And they're like, oh, she just has to take medication, thinking it's something that requires medication. And they're like, no, there's no treatment. And oh, by the way, her prognosis, you're lucky to have it till she's 19. So go home, love her, there's nothing you can do. Which obviously you can imagine the mental toll that took my parents down was immense.